If this wasn't planned and part of the agenda, believe you me, it would be a crisis if they didn't authorize it. What happened in the 1950s to start out this ball rolling? In the 1950s, they suddenly put all the known female synthetic estrogens into food supply. They put it in baby food. Procter & Gamble were the first one to admit, after investigation 40 years later, that they were using a rinse to supposedly sterilize the baby bottles, and it contained bisphenol A. An odd thing to rinse baby bottles with, when bisphenol A is the very thing that attacks young male children at that age and stops the testes from developing properly. You go back even further into more detail and you find out that the cosmetic industry were using insufflatants. Insufflation is a technique where certain carriers are put into the creams themselves, and these creams then absorb into the skin, carrying other chemicals with them. They're almost like they carry the payloads into the target in the bloodstream. We find that the women were highly toxic with the artificial bisphenol A and other ingredients, and therefore within the first 8 to 12 weeks of pregnancy with a male child, there's a very good chance that male would grow up to be either almost completely sterile or, as I say, maybe have some motile sperm. This was all understood 50 years ago. Bisphenol A, for instance, was discovered in the 1890s, and the properties it had against humans, especially males, was known then too. Now it's in all the beer cans. Great target males again. They line the cans with it. There's been many exposés on it now. The CBC in Canada, which is a government-owned television station, it's the BBC basically of Canada, did a documentary series called the Disappearing Male. And it goes through all of that in that particular talk with proof. Also, when we go back to the writings of Lord Bertrand Russell and Julian Huxley and Aldous Huxley, who were also related to the Darwins, by the way, you'll find that they talked about ways to sterilize the populations in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. But of course, and they even said they would use the needle to create a compliant, pliable population, meaning to dumb down the people and also to bring down the fertility rates. In the 1950s, across Europe and the Americas, what came out, under vast promotion, what came out? The polio vaccine came out. That was the first one ever to come out through a mass fear campaign. A massive fear campaign. Polio was very, very rare. Yet if you go back to the old Path black and white newsreels that they showed all over the world at the time, they showed you the same one boy in the iron lung, and that terrified the whole world. How many polio cases was actually there? Was it really polio? We do know that from those first shots, those injections, the generation that got them all ended up with carrying 100 simian viruses, live simian viruses in the shot, and simian 40 only had one function according to the maker, the discoverer of the vaccine, and that was to cause cancer. And I also have a copy of the discussion with this particular man and his staff admitting that. They knew that at the time. What they said was they thought that the risks outweighed the bad benefits that might come along down the road. That was their excuse. Since then, we've been trained to accept more and more inoculations until babies now get something like 30 inoculations before they're at the hospital. When you look into the big manufacturers of inoculations, like the Baxter Laboratories that were in the news recently because they sent out live flu virus along with the bird flu virus mixed together, and were caught by another country who tested it on ferrets, and the ferrets all died. They had done the very thing that they say that they're worried about happening in nature, where the common flu is mixed with a killer flu and becomes highly contagious. They actually did it by mistake, we're told, but go back into Baxter Laboratories even further, and you find Baxter Laboratories was part of IG Farben Group in World War II. They were responsible for creating chemicals and so on that were used as gas. And they were also used in other medical experiments on prisoners. That's in the records of the inquiry that went on into IG Farben. A good book to read is The Crimes and Punishment of IG Farben. All of that stuff's documented in there. All the companies, the Western corporations that were involved in the setting up of the Hitler regime are mentioned in that book. And Baxter Laboratories, the one who's coming out with all the shots we have to take supposedly for the swine flu, are still on the go. So when you go into, let's say, Connaught Laboratories as an example, Connaught Laboratories was employed during World War II to manufacture bacterium and viruses, fungus that would attack wheat and corn, etc. in Germany. Mr. Banting, who discovered insulin, the great hero Banting, during World War II, his main occupation was finding ways to annihilate the food supply of an entire country. And he came up with ideas of creating a form of what we now call mad cow disease, something that rotted the brains of the cattle for herds, dairy herds and beef herds. And it was manufactured in World War II. And I often wonder if there really is such a thing as mad cow disease, is that where it came from? But to say these big laboratories and Connaught Laboratories eventually became responsible, for instance, for the blood supply for hospitals and hemophiliacs and byproducts of blood supply. I've said for many years that the biggest international corporations are real corporations, but they're also front groups for one system. During the Cold War, for instance, many books were published on the war, how it would be won, and so on. And what they all agreed upon was those with the highest technologies would win. Now, if you were in a free enterprise system, you could never allow inventions coming out of nowhere, unauthorized, especially in communications and different means, to be given to the general public. Therefore, the CIA, MI6, and other countries' agencies created front organizations to lead the charge and control technology. You could never allow free competition in technology and give it to the people without authorization. It has to be permitted by those who rule. That goes across the board with everything, as I say, from those who rule. You create culture, you manipulate culture, you give the public what you deign to give them, you suppress that which you don't want the public to have. It must be under a control. You cannot have that with a true free market enterprise and true entrepreneurism. You can't have it. Therefore, you put up the front companies. They're real companies. They will really manufacture stuff, but it's what's been authorized. And guys at the top, CIA, MI6, fund them and run them. We've seen this with different banks that were set up by CIA in the past, where they funnel money to all the major wars that we're fighting. There was the BCCI, was one of the first ones that collapsed. Papa Bush was a director at one time, and then he was back to being director of the CIA. These are front massive banks, massive corporations. A difficult thing for some people to understand is what's happening today is not just an elite making a final move to take over anything. Every generation for hundreds of years has been brought up with the same elite's predecessors, designing and running the show for each generation. The elite, in fact, are simply moving their system into a new system, an updated system to suit themselves. That's a hard concept for people to grasp. They've been trained to believe things are happening at the moment by happenstance, by crisis coming out of nowhere. And here's what we must do. We must solve this problem at the time. Nothing is further from the truth. And when people wake up, they generally go through the same stages as someone who becomes bereaved, when you find that democracy never existed in the first place. You go through an anger phase, a depression phase. You'll blame whoever is handy, and then hopefully you emerge from it and you become active and you want to learn what's really going on and what has been going on. But you'll also eventually come to the realization that you're up against something, a system that's very, very, very old. It's the only truly organized system on the whole planet. It uses sciences that are ancient in population management. It gave us a system of money. Money is a tool that we must believe in to serve them. Karl Marx was quite right. He was one of their boys who was set up the dialectic. And he was quite right when he said that money is a tool of the elite. It's essential that the people who stop bartering or working for themselves and start using money as a means of exchange, which then can be taxed back from them, are becoming slaves. Because under law and legality, for 1,000 years, no one could take anything from you. Money represents your food, your home, everything. When it's taxed back from you, they're creating a form of slavery. Therefore, it's essential that the workers believe in money. The elite have all the money in the world. They own all the resources in the world. They don't need money, but they need us to believe it's the only thing that we must use. There's different ways to have slavery. You can either get a bunch of henchmen, force a tribe into obeying you and being your slaves. That's a lot of force. You have to feed them, etc. Or you can allow them to keep so much of their earnings for themselves to maintain themselves and take off all the rest to supply the elite and the structure of the system over them. But he says we're now in the process of creating a more sophisticated form of slavery. In other words, the general public who would drift into the system and it would become natural for them would never twig on that they were actually slaves. You tie that in with the institutions that the Huxleys and the Darwins belong to. They're all Institute for International Affairs, which has branches in every country in the world. They set up the United Nations. They said in their own writings, from the earliest times to the present, the world they're bringing in is to be a world where everyone who is born, or would be allowed to be born, would be born to serve the state. That would be their sole function. That's if they had a job for you to fulfill or a need for you. But it's a more sophisticated form of slavery, and we're going through it today. These families have been at this for at least centuries, and I think much, much longer. Why is it that the Rothschilds come onto the scene as a revolutionary family? Why is it they suddenly could take over 5 countries with 5 sons, create central banks, or take the central banks over that already existed? And why is it that right to the present time they're in the forefront of world politics? Why is that? Why doesn't a generation of the Rothschild go off in some other direction or lose interest? You're dealing here with a specific religion. A religion and a cause, a purpose. You will only find this kind of fanatical intergenerational devotion to an agenda when there's some kind of religion involved in it. When did all these families crop up? With the banks.